The moment Harold called me into his office, I knew something was off. His voice over the intercom had that falsely cheerful tone he used when delivering bad news with a smile. I adjusted my blazer, straightened my posture, and walked in prepared for anything but what actually happened. "Patricia," he said, not looking up from his monitor, "we've decided to go with Claire for the senior manager position." The room spun slightly as I processed the words that would change everything. Before I continue narrating Patricia's story, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Claire had been with the company for 6 months. I'd trained her myself, showed her the ins and outs of our client portfolio, and even helped her edit her pitch decks. She was talented, sure, but she hadn't led a single initiative on her own. Meanwhile, I had 15 years of loyalty, measurable results, and a stack of accolades Harold loved to quote when bragging about our team. Apparently, all of that meant nothing now. "She's a rising star," Harold continued, finally meeting my eyes with that infuriating smirk. "You've been rock solid, Patricia, but Claire has vision." Vision. That was the word he always used when replacing competent women with shiny new toys. I felt heat rise in my face, but kept my tone even. "Thank you for the update," I said, even as my hands trembled. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms like he'd just finished a generous favor. "We'll need your help with the transition, obviously. Claire's going to need someone reliable to keep things running smoothly during onboarding." That was the final twist of the knife. He wanted me to support the woman who'd just been promoted over me. I nodded once, then turned and left without another word. I made it back to my desk before the tears came. My cubicle felt smaller than usual, like the walls were pushing inward to squeeze the air from my lungs. Claire walked by 5 minutes later, all smiles and pink lipstick, completely unaware of the storm she'd just stepped into. "Hey, Patricia," she chirped. "Harold told me the news. I'm really excited to work together more closely." I smiled back with more control than I thought I had left. "Congratulations, Claire. I'm sure you'll do great." She moved along, oblivious, while I clicked open the hidden folder on my desktop labeled Personal. Inside were scanned emails, screenshots, time-stamped meeting notes, evidence I'd been quietly collecting for years. Not because I planned to use it, but because deep down I knew this day would come. The file was titled Insurance, a folder filled with moments Harold never thought would catch up with him. Like when he told Mike from legal that women, quote, lacked the spine for C-level stress, or when he tried to convince HR to dock Vanessa's maternity leave as excessive absence, or when he forwarded me an executive email thread about potential layoffs, then asked me to accidentally leak it to the junior staff to scare them into staying productive. It had started small, just a few forwarded emails and copied memos, but over time it became a habit. A quiet way of protecting myself in a place where fairness had a short shelf life. I didn't want revenge back then. I wanted leverage. That night, I stayed late at the office under the guise of helping Claire transition. She'd gone home hours earlier, but I remained, the hum of the HVAC system keeping me company. I opened a new document and began outlining everything. Not emotionally, not as a diary, but like a prosecutor preparing closing arguments. Precise, clinical, bulletproof. My list started with the Botelli contract. I'd single-handedly saved it after Harold forgot to schedule the final pitch meeting. Then the Murray account, which I'd grown from a minor client into one of our top 3 earners. The numbers were there. Revenue increases, client satisfaction surveys, referral metrics. Every line item was another crack in the facade Harold had built around his visionary leadership, and I intended to drive a wedge straight through it. The next morning, Harold acted like nothing had happened. He greeted me with a wink and said, "Hope there's no hard feelings about Claire. You're still my MVP." I smiled politely, the way a hunter does before pulling the trigger. "Of course, Harold. Let me know if you need help coordinating her calendar." My voice sounded calm. My heart was volcanic. Claire called a team meeting that afternoon to introduce herself in her new role. She stumbled over the names of our oldest clients and confused 2 departments entirely. I stepped in gently, offering corrections, saving face. Harold beamed from the corner like a proud uncle. I took notes quietly, letting him believe he was still in control. But control had already changed hands. By the end of the week, I'd reconnected with Vanessa, Sarah, and 3 other women who'd left under amicable conditions. Every single one had stories, some worse than mine, all of them willing to talk. Vanessa had an audio recording of Harold telling her to smile more during board meetings. Sarah had an email where Harold asked her to wear something less distracting for client presentations. Another woman, Nina, had screenshots of Slack messages so demeaning they made my skin crawl. I compiled everything, organizing the material by type, discrimination, harassment, retaliation. I called it the ledger. Not dramatic, not emotional, just a ledger of wrongs and receipts. Harold's entire empire, cataloged with the precision he'd always claimed women lacked. 2 weeks passed before the perfect opportunity presented itself. Claire's first presentation to the board. Harold planned it as her debutante ball, his protege stepping into the spotlight. "Patricia," he said, handing me the deck, "make sure this is formatted right, clean and sharp. You know, like how you used to do yours." I took the USB drive, smiling tightly. Of course, Harold. Wouldn't want Claire's big day ruined by messy transitions. He laughed, completely unaware that this presentation would indeed be memorable, just not for the reasons he expected. I spent that night adding one more slide to the deck. A final one, password protected, time to display 5 minutes after the presentation started. It was subtle, a gray background with white text. One line. "Why is this the 5th woman Harold has promoted over Patricia in 10 years?" The following morning, I arrived early to double-check every detail of the boardroom setup. Claire's presentation deck sat neatly on a flash drive, already loaded into the laptop at the podium. Harold had reserved catering, coffee, croissants, and smugness. I arranged chairs, tidied the table, and made sure the HDMI cable didn't short out when connected. The room was perfect, sterile in its anticipation, and about to become a war zone. Claire breezed in 20 minutes later, nervous but radiant. Her pantsuit was tailored, her lipstick was bold, and her confidence was unearned. "I'm so glad you're here early," she said, placing her notes on the table. "Harold said you'd help manage the flow of the meeting. He said you're the best at timing." I smiled and nodded, resisting the urge to reply. He would know. "He timed your promotion perfectly." The board members began arriving one by one, exchanging polite greetings and shaking Claire's hand with tepid enthusiasm. Robert Mills, the board chair, gave me a curt nod. He remembered me from the last 5 meetings I'd quietly supported from the back row. Claire stood at the head of the table, cue cards in hand, ready to deliver Harold's vision as her own. Harold himself strutted in last, giving me a wink like we shared some secret. We didn't. Not anymore. Claire began the presentation exactly on time. Her voice trembled slightly, but stabilized as she read from the carefully formatted slides. The first 4 slides outlined basic growth metrics, all sourced from data I'd collected. She repeated phrases I'd written: client-centric engagement, multi-platform values strategy, synergized execution model. It felt like watching someone sing a song I'd written, off-key and without soul. Slide 5 brought the shift. The screen flickered, dimmed slightly, and then displayed a plain gray background with a single line in bold white text. "Why is this the 5th woman Harold has promoted over Patricia in 10 years?" A silence so thick it muffled. The HVAC settled over the room. Claire froze, her mouth still halfway through the word initiative. Harold looked like someone had dumped ice water down his spine. I don't know how that slide got there," Claire stammered, clicking her remote rapidly. Nothing happened. The slide was locked in place for 10 full seconds, then auto-advanced to the next. See attached appendix for pattern analysis. The PDF I'd embedded began to open automatically in a new window on the screen. Robert Mills cleared his throat. "What exactly are we looking at?" he asked, directing the question to no one in particular. Claire looked at Harold, who remained frozen, his face drained of all color. "This wasn't part of the deck," Claire whispered, audibly enough that everyone heard. I I don't know what this is. Harold shot to his feet. All right, this meeting is adjourned. We'll reconvene later. There's clearly been a technical issue. No one moved. The board watched him closely, not reacting, waiting to see if he would explain further. Robert, Harold said, turning to the chair. Let's handle this offline. Robert didn't respond. Instead, he opened his folder and pulled out a printed version of the same slide, now projected on the wall. I received this last night, actually. So did everyone else on the board. Harold's face twisted into something grotesque, part confusion, part rage, part fear. Then why? Why are we even here? Because I wanted to see how you'd handle it in public, Robert replied calmly. I wanted to see whether the accusations would rattle you. They clearly do. Harold opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Claire sat down slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the table. What is going on? She asked quietly, directing the question at Harold now. Why is your name all over this? Harold turned toward her, furious. Don't look at me like I planted this. Ask Patricia. She's the one with a grudge. I stood up then, my chair scraping softly against the carpet. Actually, yes, I did send those documents, I said evenly. I also CC'd legal, HR, and external counsel. I figured if we were airing dirty laundry, it might as well be clean and folded. The silence after that line was not empty. It was loaded. Claire looked at me with disbelief, as if seeing me for the first time. You sabotaged my presentation? She asked, her voice tight. No, I replied, meeting her gaze. I added context. Robert Mills looked between us, then nodded slowly, as if confirming something in his own mind. Let's take a 10-minute break, he said, and then reconvene without Harold. Harold started to object, but the room had already moved past him. Claire stood and walked out quietly, and the board followed without fanfare. Harold and I were left alone, the gray slide still glowing behind us like a ghost refusing to leave. You've ruined everything, he spat. You think this gets you a promotion? I picked up my folder, calm as ice. No, I said, it gets me justice. Harold's laugh was bitter and forced. You've always been petty, Patricia. That's why you never moved up. I tilted my head, studying the man who had cost me years of growth and countless nights of peace. No, Harold, I've always been patient. That's why you never saw this coming. He opened his mouth again, but I walked out before he could finish. 10 minutes later, I returned to the boardroom, where Claire sat staring at her hands and the board members whispered among themselves. Robert gestured to the seat beside him. Patricia, would you join us? He said. We have some questions. I nodded and sat down. Let's start with this ledger you compiled, Robert said. 3 years of documentation, signed client feedback, promotion records, salary audits. Why now? I looked him straight in the eyes. Because Claire was the 5th. I wasn't going to wait for number 6. Robert nodded, tapping his pen against the folder slowly. 3 years is a long time to gather this much information, he said. Why didn't you come to us sooner? I glanced around the table, my fingers laced neatly in front of me, because Harold was the gatekeeper to every conversation that mattered. And I needed proof you'd believe more than just my word. Elena Vasquez, head of HR compliance, leaned forward in her chair. This goes beyond HR concerns, she said. There are financial documents here. Misreported budgets, inflated consultant fees. Patricia, did you personally verify these figures? I gave a single nod, pulling a second flash drive from my folder. Cross-checked against internal databases and verified against vendor records. Every line has a source. Thomas Chong, the CFO, whistled low under his breath. Frank Thompson Consulting, he muttered. That's Harold's brother's shell company, isn't it? Robert shot him a sharp glance. We'll confirm all personal ties in due course, he said. But if what Patricia has provided is accurate, Harold's in deeper than we thought. I felt Claire's eyes on me as she shifted uncomfortably in her chair. You let me walk into that meeting blind, she said, finally. You knew what was coming and didn't say anything. I turned to face her fully, not unkind but unflinching. I didn't sabotage you, Claire. I showed you exactly how it feels. Claire blinked, her mouth twitching as if she wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. You could have warned me, she said, softer now, given me a heads up. So I could watch you hesitate and then tell Harold everything? I asked, keeping my voice low. No offense, Claire, but your loyalty was never mine to trust. Elena flipped through the printouts again, stopping at a section labeled Succession Timeline. 5 male executives promoted in under 4 years, she said. 3 of them with less experience than Patricia, and yet she remained in the same role, handling their mistakes, writing their reports. She looked at me now, her expression somewhere between apology and admiration. You built this company's reputation from behind the curtain. I didn't respond, but the faintest warmth bloomed in my chest. After so many years of being the invisible backbone, someone finally said it out loud. The board reviewed everything in silence for several minutes. Claire sat stiffly, her arms crossed but eyes darting from document to document. She wasn't defending Harold, but she wasn't ready to absolve me either. We'll need to call a formal session, Robert finally said. Legal will have to be present. There are potential liabilities here, civil and possibly criminal. Elena, can you initiate protocol on executive misconduct investigations? Elena gave a curt nod and began typing into her tablet immediately. Claire stood abruptly. I'd like to be recused from this process, she said. I was misled. But I don't want to be seen as either an accomplice or a victim. Her voice didn't shake, but the tension in her shoulders told me this had rattled her deeply. Granted, Robert said. We'll notify you when the internal interviews begin. After the meeting, I returned to my desk, the familiar clack of my keyboard oddly grounding. My inbox was already lighting up, HR confirmations, legal requests, anonymous thank yous from coworkers I hadn't even spoken to in months. The silence around Harold's office was deafening. No more booming voice, no casual jokes at someone's expense. Just the echo of someone who'd finally run out of power. Susan messaged me from 2 floors down. Is it true? You really did it? I replied with a single sentence. Not yet. But I opened the door. Susan had started 6 months ago. Another new face Harold had tried to groom into obedience. She'd lasted 2 weeks under his praise, before requesting a department transfer. I'd kept my distance from her then, unsure if she was just another Claire, or something else. But she'd made her move early, distancing herself from Harold while quietly excelling under the radar. I sent her a secure file link. If you have anything to add, now's the time. 3 minutes later, I saw the file begin to populate. Susan had plenty. Her contribution included 3 email chains where Harold had requested after-hours strategy sessions at local bars. She had screenshots of late-night Slack messages where he commented on her appearance with thinly veiled innuendo. There was even a calendar invite labeled Private Prep No Minutes, sent only to her and Harold for a meeting that never appeared on the official agenda. It was all consistent with the pattern I'd outlined. Harold had been predictable, consistently unoriginal in his manipulations. By the end of the week, the board had convened an emergency closed-door session. Harold arrived wearing a forced smile and a poorly knotted tie. He carried no papers, no defense, just that smug confidence that had seen him through every previous scandal. But this time, there were no handshakes, no allies waiting to pat him on the back, just 6 grim faces and 1 empty chair where I would soon be sitting. Mr. Thompson, Robert began, you've been asked here to respond to allegations of misconduct. Harold raised a hand, interrupting with a sneer. Let me guess. Patricia's behind this. She's always been jealous, always wanted more than she was worth. I'd suggest you stop talking now, Elena said sharply. Your words are being recorded. Harold's mouth snapped shut, but the rage in his eyes burned hot. If you have anything of value to submit, Thomas added, now is the time. Harold remained silent. After a moment, Robert turned toward the side door. Patricia, would you join us? I stepped in quietly, setting my folder down on the table as Harold's eyes followed my every move. He looked at me like I was an intruder. This was my house now. I opened the folder slowly, deliberately. I've itemized every incident by date, department, and cost to company performance, I said. This isn't personal. This is professional accountability. Harold scoffed, but didn't interrupt again. He already knew he was losing. The last page of my report was labeled Consequences. Not threats, just outcomes, each one tied to measurable damages. Employee turnover, client attrition, legal risk exposure, reputational damage. I ended the presentation the way Harold always had, confident, unwavering, precise. You can let him resign quietly, or you can take this public and explain why you didn't act sooner. The boardroom was silent after my final sentence, each member processing what I'd laid before them. Harold sat rigidly in his chair, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching. Robert flipped the last page of the report, then folded his hands calmly. "Thank you, Patricia. You may return to the outer office. We'll deliberate internally from here." As I stood, Harold blurted out, "You're bluffing. This is just a smear campaign from a bitter assistant." I turned slowly, leveling my gaze at him without emotion. "Then you should have no trouble disproving anything I've submitted," I replied. Elena rose from her seat, signaling the conversation was over. "That'll be all, Mr. Thompson." I walked out, but I didn't go far. I stood just outside the door, beside the receptionist's desk, pretending to check my phone. Inside, I could hear muted voices rising and falling, punctuated by long silences. No yelling, no dramatic slamming of fists, just the slow, meticulous unraveling of a man who'd never imagined he'd have to answer for anything. 15 years of harm, finally meeting 15 minutes of justice. It took 27 minutes before the door opened again. Robert emerged first, flanked by Elena and Thomas, all three with unreadable expressions. Harold trailed behind them, holding a manila envelope and looking like he'd aged a decade in half an hour. His blazer was wrinkled now, the knot of his tie slightly undone. He didn't look at me as he walked past, just kept moving toward the elevator like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Robert turned back toward me. "We'll speak privately tomorrow," he said. "There are next steps, and the board wants your input." I nodded once, not trusting myself to speak without emotion. Elena offered a quick, tight smile. "You did everything exactly right," she said quietly. He didn't see it coming. After they left, I returned to my desk, my body heavy with a mixture of adrenaline and fatigue. Word was already spreading through the building like smoke under a locked door. Susan stopped by 10 minutes later with 2 coffees in hand and a smile that wasn't quite celebration but wasn't sympathy either. "I just saw him get in the elevator," she said, sitting beside me. "He looked like someone told him his yacht sank." I sipped the coffee, letting the warmth anchor me. "He handed in his resignation," I said. "Effective immediately, pending audit of his final expense reports and formal exit interview." Susan raised an eyebrow. "They're really auditing him?" I pulled open my email and showed her the incoming message from Elena. Every receipt, every vendor, every line item he ever signed off on. Over the next 48 hours, the building felt different. Like someone had turned off a pressure valve that no one realized had been squeezing the air out of us. Colleagues who'd rarely spoken to me except through Harold's directives now smiled in the break room. People looked me in the eyes instead of past me. The fear that had haunted every hallway was evaporating. On Friday morning, I met with the board again in a smaller conference room, this time without the shadow of Harold looming over us. Robert greeted me with a firm handshake and a folder labeled Transition Options. Elena offered me a seat at the table, not beside it, but at it. "We'd like to formally discuss your future here," Robert began. "But first, we want to ask what you want." It was the first time anyone had asked me that question in 15 years. Not what I could do or what I was willing to sacrifice, but what I wanted. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that moment settle inside me. "I want to rebuild what Harold broke," I said. "And I want to make sure no one else ever has to survive what I did." Robert nodded, flipping to the second page of the folder. "The board is prepared to offer you the role of Interim Director of Strategy," he said. "We understand it's not quite the title you deserve after carrying this place for so long, but we want to do this the right way, formally, transparently." I scanned the document, noting the increase in salary, the inclusion of full decision-making authority, and the 6-month review timeline. It was more than I'd expected, and less than I knew I could demand. But it was the right kind of beginning. "I accept," I said, signing the bottom of the page with a pen. Elena slid across the table. "And I want Susan on my team." She saw through Harold from the beginning. "She deserves more than a tucked-away analyst role." Robert smiled. "Already noted. We've been watching her too." My first day in the new office felt surreal. Harold's name had already been scrubbed from the executive directory. His framed Leader of the Year award had vanished from the hallway. His corner office sat empty, the air stale from disuse. I didn't want his office anyway. I wanted the one facing the bullpen, where I could actually see the people doing the work. Susan joined me that afternoon, laptop in hand and a nervous smile on her face. "So, do I call you Patricia, boss? Or ma'am now?" she asked playfully. "Just Patricia," I said. "But I might start calling you vice president in training if you keep pulling reports like those." Her eyes widened. "Wait, seriously?" "Not today," I said, gesturing for her to sit. "But someday. We're going to build something better here, and I want you to be part of that foundation." Susan nodded, her excitement barely contained. "Okay then, what's first?" We started with the ledger. Not Harold's anymore, but ours. A shared document where we listed policies to rewrite, cultural changes to implement, systems to audit. Everything Harold had weaponized, we were going to neutralize. For every backroom deal he made, we'd open a door. That weekend, I stayed late both nights, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The silence of the office without Harold's booming voice was comforting now. I found old memos I'd written, that he'd signed as his own. I archived them carefully, not out of bitterness, but as a record of how far we'd come. The past would remain accessible, but it would no longer define us. Monday morning brought with it a different kind of energy, curious, cautious, and strangely optimistic. People lingered by the coffee machine, their conversations no longer punctuated by glances over shoulders. For the first time in years, I walked through the office and didn't feel invisible. There were smiles, nods, even whispered thank yous from employees who once avoided eye contact entirely. It wasn't a parade, but it was a beginning. I met with HR to begin reviewing internal complaints that had been buried or quietly dismissed under Harold's tenure. Elena provided me with a locked cabinet's worth of files, formal reports, informal notes, and some unsigned letters that broke my heart. There were patterns, of course. Women labeled emotional for voicing concerns, promotions delayed without cause, pay gaps justified by experience that didn't exist. One by one, we opened every file and built a spreadsheet that wouldn't be hidden again. Susan helped cross-reference dates and decisions, our new justice audit growing faster than we'd expected. At lunch, I received a call from Vanessa, one of the former employees who had contributed to the ledger. "I heard he's gone," she said, her voice laced with both disbelief and relief. "He is," I confirmed, "resigned under pressure, pending audits and legal review. You were a big part of making that happen." Vanessa laughed softly, the sound edged with something old and heavy finally lifting. "I never thought I'd see the day," she said. "I used to dream about walking into his office and just flipping his desk over." I smiled, picturing it. I handled the desk flipping metaphorically, but I assure you, the effect was just as satisfying. That afternoon, I received a calendar invite labeled simply Board Strategy Debrief, Private. When I entered the room, only Robert and Elena were seated, their expressions unreadable. "We wanted to talk about the next phase," Robert said, motioning to the chair across from him. "Harold's resignation doesn't erase what happened under his leadership, but it gives us a chance to correct it." I nodded, ready. Robert slid a proposal across the table. "We want to launch an internal task force led by you to investigate department-level inequities and recommend structural changes. Reporting will be direct to the board. You'll have full authority to collect data, conduct interviews, and restructure as needed." I flipped through the proposal, scanning terms, timelines, and approval pathways. This is more than I expected. "It's also more than anyone else can handle," Elena added. "You know the system from both sides." And you've proven you can navigate the politics without losing your integrity. I looked up, my fingers still resting on the pages. Then let's build something better. By Friday, the task force was assembled. 6 women and 2 men from across departments, all chosen based on anonymous peer nominations. They were analysts, coordinators, mid-level managers, all people who had been overlooked, underestimated, or ignored. We met in Conference Room C, the one Harold never used because the chairs weren't leather. I brought coffee, notebooks, and one simple rule. Everything we say in this room stays here until we're ready to make it public. Heads nodded, and pens clicked. Each person shared one experience they'd never felt safe revealing. Susan talked about the way Harold would hover behind her chair during presentations, offering, quote, feedback only when others were around to witness it. Marcus, our operations rep, shared how Harold routinely dismissed logistics concerns in meetings, only to later blame him for delays. Priya from accounting had been denied a raise for 3 years, despite exceeding every benchmark. The stories came slow at first, but soon the dam broke. I didn't just listen, I documented. Every anecdote became a data point. Every data point became a pattern. By the end of the second week, we'd identified 12 recurring forms of professional sabotage used across 3 departments. Most had Harold's fingerprints on them, but some had spread further, enabled by supervisors who mimicked his behavior without realizing it. Susan noticed it first. Some of these managers don't even know they're doing it, she said, highlighting a list of comments employees had anonymously flagged. They inherited the tone from Harold. He modeled how to lead, and they assumed that was just how things worked. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing that. Then part of this has to be unlearning. I began scheduling one-on-one meetings with department heads, starting with those who had the most red flags. My approach wasn't accusatory. It was educational. This isn't about punishment, I explained to Darren from logistics. It's about accountability. And if you're willing to do the work, we'll help you course correct. Some responded with defensiveness, others with shame. A few denied everything until presented with documentation so specific it erased any room for argument. But most eventually understood the message. The old way wasn't coming back, and if they wanted to stay, they had to evolve. Late one evening, Susan stayed behind to help organize our findings for the next board review. As we worked, she paused, staring out the window at the city lights. "You know," she said quietly, "when I first met you, I thought you were just another fixture here, like a lamp Harold kept in the corner because it was convenient." I laughed softly. That's exactly what I was, until I started to spark. Susan smiled, her eyes thoughtful. "You didn't just take him down, you created something better in the space he left behind." I looked at our organized files, the web of names and connections slowly untangling under our guidance. Revenge ends things. This is the beginning of something. The next board meeting arrived with little fanfare, but enormous weight. I presented our initial findings using a clean visual breakdown of structural inequities and their impact on company performance. Elena backed me up with cross-departmental statistics, and Susan handled the Q&A with effortless composure. When we finished, Robert set down his pen and looked around the table. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most productive presentation we've seen in a year." Applause followed, not wild or performative, but sincere. For the first time, change wasn't just discussed, it was happening. And I wasn't just part of it, I was leading it. The Monday after that board meeting, everything felt sharper, like the building itself had taken a deep breath. People held their heads higher in the elevators, and even the break room chatter carried a hint of relief. Our internal portal launched the Fair Growth Initiative at 9 a.m. sharp, complete with an FAQ and anonymous reporting tool. Within the first hour, 22 submissions came through, none of them petty, all of them real, and all of them actionable. By noon, I'd blocked off time to personally read every entry. Some came from departments I'd never worked with, which only proved the rot had spread farther than Harold's corner. There was one from a junior developer named Kamira, who'd been assigned the same entry-level project for over a year, despite requesting advanced training. Another came from sales, Jamal, who'd been passed up for client-facing roles in favor of less experienced reps with better polish. Their words weren't angry. They were exhausted. Susan brought her tablet over with narrowed eyes. "This one's from records," she said, flipping it around. Apparently, Harold rerouted their budget for 3 quarters straight, then blamed them for not digitizing faster. I skimmed the message, noting the internal approval code. "We can verify that through accounting logs," I said. "If it checks out, we adjust their budget immediately and note which managers signed off." The following morning, I stood in front of a full company town hall for the first time. I wasn't a polished public speaker like Harold, and I didn't pretend to be. I wore a simple navy blazer, no flashy slides or dramatic lighting, just the truth and a microphone. "We're not fixing the past to look good," I began. "We're doing it because pretending it didn't happen makes it inevitable." There was no applause at first, just the weight of acknowledgement. I explained the Fair Growth Initiative, introduced the task force publicly, and committed to monthly updates on progress, failures included. "Transparency without accountability is theater," I said. "We're here to build trust, not branding." Then I stepped back, letting Susan take over and outline the logistics. That night, I stayed later than usual, organizing the first round of approved internal shifts. Priya from accounting was finally promoted to senior financial analyst. Kamira received a training stipend and was paired with a mentor from our tech innovation team. Jamal was reassigned to lead our new diversity-forward sales strategy. Each move was documented in a shared dashboard viewable by the board and HR. Around 8 p.m., Elena stopped by my office with 2 mugs of tea and tired eyes. "You're building something incredible," she said, handing me one. "But you're going to burn out if you don't pace yourself." I took the mug gratefully and leaned back in my chair. 15 years of sprinting in place. Turns out I've got stamina. Elena laughed, but there was concern behind it. "I know that tone," she said. "The one that says, if I don't do it all, it won't get done right. Trust your team, Patricia. Let them carry some of this." I nodded, knowing she was right, and knowing it would take effort to actually listen. The next morning, I delegated 2 major audit follow-ups to Susan and Marcus. Both were thorough, disciplined, and understood the company's cultural undercurrents better than any consultant ever could. Trusting them wasn't the challenge. Letting go was. But I watched from a slight distance as they handled their tasks with grace and grit. They weren't just doing the work, they were modeling the future. Later that week, an unexpected message appeared in my inbox. Subject line: Inquiry regarding Harold Thompson. It was from a journalist at Business Insight Weekly, someone I'd seen speak on corporate reform panels. She'd gotten wind of the Fair Growth Initiative and wanted to discuss the transformation of Meridian following executive leadership turnover. It was the polite way of asking about Harold's downfall. I forwarded the message to Robert with a single question: do we respond? He called me within 5 minutes. "If we say nothing, they'll write it anyway," he said. "But if you're going to talk, it has to be about solutions, not revenge." I understood immediately. The interview was scheduled for the following Tuesday, conducted in a bright downtown cafe instead of a sterile boardroom. The journalist, Karina Leung, was sharp and empathetic, her questions probing but respectful. "You had every right to disappear after what happened," she said. "Why stay?" I stirred my tea once, then looked her in the eye. "Because someone had to make sure the next me didn't have to survive the same story." The article went live the following Friday, under the headline, "From Silenced to CEO, the Woman Rewriting Corporate Power." It went viral within hours, not because it was scandalous, but because it was familiar. Thousands of women commented with their own stories, some eerily similar, some heartbreakingly worse. My inbox filled again, but this time with encouragement. Harold didn't reach out. I didn't expect him to. But his name popped up again during a budget reconciliation audit. A small overage had been flagged on an old vendor account linked to his final months. I opened the record and saw it. A consulting fee listed under a shell vendor already known from the ledger. Susan glanced over and sighed. Another skeleton. I didn't feel anger anymore, just certainty. "Let's turn it over to legal," I said, "and add it to the ethics training case studies." Every mistake he left behind would become fuel for smarter systems. No cover-ups, no forgetting. In the months that followed, Meridian's growth outpaced projections by 22%. Employee retention hit an all-time high. Even the most cynical board members admitted we were seeing something rare, a company healing in public, on purpose, and at the center of it, I wasn't the star. I was the standard. 6 months after Harold's resignation, the board voted unanimously to remove the interim from my title. I stood in the same room where I'd once delivered coffee and meeting minutes, now addressed as Chief Executive Officer. There was no speech, no champagne, just a signed document and a room full of nods that carried the weight of transformation. Robert clapped my shoulder with a smile that reached his eyes. "It's not just that you earned it," he said. "It's that you made the title mean something again." I celebrated quietly with Susan and Marcus in my office after hours, ordering takeout and pulling paper plates from a filing drawer. "Do you ever think about him?" Susan asked, biting into her egg roll. I didn't need clarification. "Only when I remember how many fires I had to put out that he started," I said. "But honestly, Harold's just background noise now." Still, some things lingered longer than others. The old fear in people's voices when they asked questions, the way they hesitated before disagreeing with leadership. Years of damage didn't disappear just because the abuser was gone, so we implemented what we called voice checks, anonymous feedback channels that triggered real-time flags when employee concerns aligned with toxic patterns. Every month, we published a summary of what we heard and what we did about it. Transparency wasn't just a buzzword anymore. It was policy, measured by impact. Elena helped roll out the training curriculum we developed in partnership with external equity consultants. We didn't call it anti-Harold training, but everyone knew. Susan joked we should have named it How Not to Burn Down Trust in 5 Easy Steps. Some board members worried we were being too aggressive. "Will this discourage strong leadership?" one asked in a closed-door review. I answered calmly. "If your definition of strength is unchecked power, yes. But if it's clarity, accountability, and results, then we're building the strongest team in this company's history." No one argued after that. One day, during a quarterly metrics review, Marcus pulled me aside. "You should see this," he said, handing me a tablet. It was an internal email thread flagged by our voice check system. A senior manager in procurement had started subtly undermining a new hire, an echo of Harold's tactics. The hair on my neck stood up. I read the thread twice before speaking. "Has anyone else noticed?" I asked. "Not yet," Marcus said, "but the pattern matches 2 complaints from the same floor. New hires freezing in meetings, delegation without authority, credit being rerouted." I nodded grimly. "We're not waiting for it to fester." We confronted the manager the following day, Elena sitting beside me as I laid out the timeline. He looked shocked, defensive, and then quietly ashamed as the evidence mounted. "I didn't realize I was doing it," he said. "I thought I was managing like I was taught." That phrase clung to me long after he resigned. Culture wasn't just policy, it was inheritance. And we'd inherited a mess. I used to think removing Harold was the win, but now I knew the real work was rebuilding what his presence had taught others to normalize. We were winning when people stopped fearing their boss more than their mistakes. The next few months passed in a rhythm of restructuring, growing, and refining. We launched our first internal mentorship program led by mid-career professionals, not just executives. Susan paired up with Camira, who had already coded an internal dashboard that eliminated hours of manual data entry each week. Jamal ran a training series on ethical sales strategy that became so popular, we opened it up to external partners. People weren't just staying, they were thriving. Late one afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. Not email, not certified document. A handwritten envelope addressed in familiar, sharp lettering. The return address said nothing. I opened it slowly, scanning the short message inside. "Patricia, Uj. I don't expect you to read this, let alone forgive anything, but I've spent the last 6 months trying to understand who I was. You were right. I built power on sand and called it strength. I hope one day the version of me that writes this will matter more than the one who walked into that boardroom. HT. I read it 3 times, each pass feeling different. Not because I believed in redemption, but because part of me had always wondered if he'd just keep denying it forever. I didn't respond. I didn't frame it or shred it. I filed it under past, then went back to work. That evening, as I prepared for a guest lecture at a university business program, Susan knocked lightly and peeked in. "Ready to go inspire the next generation of corporate dragon slayers?" she asked. I laughed, grabbing my notes and jacket. I'm just hoping they remember to check their own biases before someone like me has to make a ledger again. The lecture hall was full, mostly women in tailored blazers and a few men with curious eyes. I spoke not as a survivor, but as an architect of systems, of culture, of self-respect. I walked them through the anatomy of injustice disguised as policy. I ended with a single truth: no title, no salary, and no corner office is worth your silence. Afterward, a student approached me, clutching a notebook. "Did you ever think you'd end up here?" she asked. I shook my head. No. But I stopped thinking about where I deserved to be and started building where I wanted to be. By the time we returned to the office the next morning, the sun was pouring through the windows like it hadn't in years. The building no longer felt like a machine. It felt like a place. My office plant, once wilted and forgotten during long nights under Harold's rule, had started to bloom. So had everything else, and I intended to keep it growing. 2 weeks after that lecture, I got a message from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They'd received a bundled complaint packet referencing Harold's tenure, submitted anonymously but supported with airtight documentation. I recognized the formatting. It was the ledger, or at least a version of it. Someone had finally pulled the legal trigger I never did. Susan glanced over at the email and simply said it was time. The agency wasn't reaching out to accuse, but to inform and request cooperation. They were launching a formal investigation into executive discrimination patterns within the broader tech sector, and Meridian's transformation made us a prime case study. I agreed to an interview with their lead investigator and turned over redacted versions of the files we'd used internally. "We won't focus on one man," I told the agent, "but I can show you exactly how systems were designed to protect him." The interview took place in a neutral conference center, just off a quiet industrial street. The agent, a middle-aged woman named Carla, had a practiced calm about her, polite, but all business. "We're seeing the same patterns you documented, but most companies don't track them this cleanly," she said, flipping through the printed audit. "How did you know what to look for?" I folded my hands in my lap. "Because I spent 15 years watching what no one wanted to see." Carla nodded slowly, making a note. "This," she said, tapping the section on departmental promotion disparities, "is going to become our benchmark. I'd like your permission to use parts of this as training material, with names removed." I hesitated, only a moment. If it stopped someone else from staying silent as long as I did, yes. For the first time, I was giving my story away, on purpose. Back at Meridian, the company had grown into its new values, like a plant finally repotted. We expanded our internship program and opened mentorship roles across every department, prioritizing those who'd once been passed over. Jamal's sales cohort produced 3 of our top 5 new clients in the quarter, all of them businesses led by women and minority founders. Elena introduced flexible leave structures for caregiving, which immediately boosted morale. Susan implemented quarterly listening tours, meeting small teams in person and returning with raw notes we actually acted on. At our 1-year post-Herald review, the board presented the metrics that told the real story. Productivity was up 28%. Voluntary turnover had dropped below industry average for the first time in a decade. Female leadership representation had increased by 40%, and employee satisfaction surveys showed a 92% confidence rating in ethical leadership. Robert, reading the report, leaned back with a smile and said, "This isn't just a comeback, it's a redefinition." We celebrated with catered lunch in the courtyard instead of some sterile catered banquet. No speeches, no plaques, just laughter, sunlight, and people who didn't feel like they had to pretend anymore. I sat beside Patricia Rodriguez, my former supervisor's secretary, now head of administrative operations. "You always knew how to keep everything moving," I told her. Now the title finally caught up. She laughed. "And now you don't look like you carry the weight of a building on your back anymore." I smiled, feeling the truth of that settle into my bones. Turns out the building got lighter when we let the right people hold it together. She raised her lemonade like a toast to shared weight and even distribution. A few days later, I received a LinkedIn message that made me stop breathing for a moment. It was from Claire. I hadn't spoken to her since the day Harold resigned, and I didn't even know where she'd ended up. The message was short. Saw the article in Business Insight. You were right. I wasn't ready then. I'm trying to be now. I stared at the screen for a full minute before replying. Trying counts. Growth doesn't erase the past, but it makes the next chapter possible. She responded a few minutes later. If you ever need another voice for your task force, I'd be honored. I didn't reply right away, not because I didn't believe her, but because I wanted to make sure I wasn't responding out of sentiment. I waited 2 weeks, then sent her an invitation to speak at a panel on professional accountability. The event was part of a new series we were piloting, Redesigning Leadership, Stories from the Inside. We invited professionals who'd seen toxic systems up close, whether as victims, bystanders, or even former enablers turned reformers. Claire was nervous, but she spoke with clarity and humility. She didn't paint herself as a hero. She just told the truth. My mistake wasn't ambition, she said on stage. It was trusting someone else's power more than my own judgment. Patricia showed me that silence is easier, but it costs more than most of us realize. I should have spoken up. Now I spend every day trying to make sure someone else doesn't feel as alone as I made her feel. When she stepped down, the applause was real. Not adoring, respectful. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and I didn't hand it out. But in that moment, I felt the circle close, not with revenge, but with resolution. In the third quarter, we began expanding into 2 new markets, an initiative Harold had once dismissed as too progressive for our brand. This time, our campaign was led by Chimera, whose voice once echoed silently from anonymous complaint boxes. She presented the pitch deck with Susan, who had learned to lead from someone who once kept her in the shadows. Jamal reviewed the financial strategy, adding insights about market equity gaps and long-term value alignment. It was, without question, the best campaign we'd ever built. As I watched them from the back of the room, I felt something unfamiliar wash over me. It wasn't pride. Pride had already had its moment. It was peace, a kind of deep, still knowledge that all the noise, all the pain, all the restraint, it had led somewhere worthy, and now it could speak for itself. That night, I walked home under a lavender sky, the city lights blinking on like stars. I passed the coffee shop where Susan and I had planned our first retaliation meeting. I passed the bench where I once sat crying into my lunch, too afraid to quit and too broken to hope. I passed the shadows of who I used to be, nodding to each one like an old friend. And when I reached my door, I didn't look back. The following quarter opened with the announcement that Meridian had been selected as one of the top 10 companies in the country for ethical leadership. The recognition came from an independent industry watchdog, one that had once quietly flagged us under Harold's leadership for inconsistent internal governance. Now they highlighted us as a model for transformation through accountability. The article referenced our internal reporting tools, task force transparency, and board-approved restitution plans. More importantly, it noted that Meridian's healing was driven not by rebranding, but by rebuilding trust, one policy, one person at a time. I stood in front of the employee gathering the day the news broke, my hands folded in front of me, letting the team read the headline projected behind me before I said a word. You did this, I said, looking around the room. You told the truth, you stood your ground, and you made this place better. Every suggestion, every complaint, every late night fixing what someone else broke, that's what earned this. The applause was quiet at first, but it grew, not like cheering for a speaker, but like recognizing ourselves for the first time. Later that day, I walked past Harold's old office again. It had been turned into a team wellness center, quiet rooms, rotating therapists, yoga sessions, and a book swap corner. The door was open, and inside Jamal sat with Chimera, both of them laughing over something written on the whiteboard wall. It used to be a place of fear, tension, and control. Now it was a place of recovery and conversation. Susan joined me in the hallway, holding her tablet and a folder marked Q4 Innovation Proposals. Sometimes I forget what this place used to feel like, she said, glancing inside. Then I see that whiteboard and remember how far we've come. I nodded. It's not just the office that changed. It's what people believe is possible. That afternoon, I received another handwritten letter, this time from Harold's former secretary, Anne, who had left the company 5 years ago after a sudden medical leave. Her resignation had always felt abrupt, but no one questioned it then. Now, her letter told the truth. He punished me for needing time, she wrote. Told me sick women weren't built for leadership, and made me train my replacement from a hospital bed. I sat with her letter for a long time, grieving the silence she'd been forced to carry. We added her story to the growing collection in our Stories That Matter archive, an internal platform where current and former employees could share anonymously. Each submission was moderated, verified, and published only with consent. It became more than a record. It became a mirror, a reminder that even after the damage is cleaned up, the memory still matters. That winter, we hosted our first employee-led summit on inclusive leadership. We invited outside speakers, hosted workshops, and featured a keynote titled, "Not the Exception, Why Competent Women Aren't Unicorns." Susan gave the closing speech, and it stunned the room. I used to think power came from proximity, she said, but it comes from purpose. And the only thing that ever changed this company was when women stopped asking for permission. The crowd gave her a standing ovation. I stood at the back of the room, tears stinging the corners of my eyes, not because I was proud of her, though I was, but because I knew what it cost her to get there. When I first met Susan, she was careful, guarded, calculating her steps in Harold's shadow. Now she stood in her own light, casting shadows others would grow in. And she'd never once forgotten where she came from. Back at the office the next morning, I found a small bouquet on my desk. 3 pale yellow tulips, a color I'd once said reminded me of calm mornings before the world knew what to ask of me. The note was unsigned. I knew who it was from. Claire had started sending quiet gestures instead of messages, a subtle apology blooming petal by petal. In March, the EEOC report went public, listing Meridian as a rare case study of internal justice reform. The section on Harold was clinical, names redacted, details anonymized, but anyone who'd worked under him knew exactly who it was. Our part in the report wasn't celebratory. It was instructional. Justice doesn't always look like headlines, the report said. Sometimes it looks like a meeting where no one raises their voice because they don't have to. We printed and framed that line for the hallway outside our HR department. Every employee passed it on their way to raise a concern, file a suggestion, or simply ask for support. Elena had it engraved on the back of her office chair. Not as a boast, but as a reminder. Power can be quiet when it's honest. Later that spring, our expansion into 2 additional cities was approved unanimously by the board. Kamira was tapped to lead our innovation satellite in Portland, and Jamal chose to relocate to oversee ethical partnerships in Chicago. I called them both into my office before the announcements. "This is what happens when people are trusted to build without being watched," I told them. "Now go make spaces that feel like this one." As they left, Susan stepped in with a report under her arm. "There's something I want to talk about," she said, unusually hesitant. I motioned to the seat across from me, instantly alert. "It's not bad," she added quickly. "It's just big." She set down a draft of a new policy she'd written on internal whistleblower protection, one that would allow for escalation beyond even my desk, directly to a third-party review board. "We need something stronger than internal trust," she said. "Even if it's us running the system now, we shouldn't be the final stop." I picked up the draft and started reading, my heart swelling with pride. "Let's make it official," I said. "Even the best leaders need guardrails." That evening, I stayed late again, not because something was broken, but because I wanted to be present with the company I now recognized as mine. Outside the window, the streetlights flickered on, and I thought about all the nights I used to cry in my car before going home. 15 years had passed since I'd first walked through those doors, fresh out of business school, hopeful and naive. I didn't get the career I was promised. I got something better, the power to protect others from broken promises. The morning of my 15th work anniversary arrived with no fanfare, just how I preferred it. I brewed my own coffee, took the long route through the city, and arrived before anyone else. My badge still beeped at the front door like it always had, but now it opened to a place I had remade with my own hands. There was no herald at the top anymore, no shadow hanging over the stairwells, just light, clean walls and names on plaques that once would have never seen the inside of a boardroom. At my desk, I found a card waiting, simple, unsealed, addressed in Susan's handwriting. Inside was a single line. You didn't just stay, you made it worth staying for. Below that, signatures filled the space like a mosaic. Old interns turned managers, once quiet assistants, now department heads. And even Elena's tight, looping script that read, "Justice is best served with receipts." I smiled, pressing the card gently between my palms. No plaque, no party, just the kind of recognition that actually mattered. Mid-morning, I met with the strategy team for our quarterly roadmap. The conference room buzzed with ideas, not safe ones, but bold, even risky proposals rooted in community trust and real-time data. Marcus pitched a redesign of our internal systems to decentralize authority further. If leadership can't be questioned, he said, it stops being leadership and starts being legacy building. Kamira, now remote from Portland, dialed in to present 3 new pilot programs she'd built from the equity platform we'd seeded together. When the meeting ended, I stayed behind a moment, staring at the whiteboard wall. There were no names crossed out, no credits stolen, just tasks, timelines, and clear roles, none of them needing clarification because we respected each other enough to be direct. I ran my hand over the board once, grounding myself in the realness of what we'd made. Later that afternoon, Elena invited me to a private office with Robert already seated. "We want to talk succession," she said without preamble. My heart didn't sink or skip. It just steadied. "You're not being pushed out," Robert added with a quick smile. "But you've built something too good to not plan for its future." We talked openly for over an hour about what came next. Not just for me, but for the company. I suggested building a leadership collective rather than naming a single heir. "Make it harder for power to centralize," I said. "If we've learned anything, it's that one unchecked voice becomes a risk, not a reward." They agreed, noting that we were in a rare position to design a post-CEO culture from scratch. Walking out of that meeting, I didn't feel the kind of dread I once associated with transitions. I felt clarity. Legacy wasn't about staying in the seat. It was about making sure the seat itself didn't matter more than the people sitting around it. If I'd done anything right, it was removing the crown from the throne. Susan stopped me in the hallway with a question in her eyes. "Did they bring it up?" I nodded, and I brought it down. She exhaled and smiled. "Then, we're ready." That weekend, I drove out to my parents' old house, not to visit them, but to finally collect the box I'd left in their attic. Inside was the leather portfolio my father gave me when I graduated business school, still worn at the corners. I found the pearl earrings my mother gave me for confidence, still tucked in a small velvet pouch. Beneath them were printouts of my first ever pitch deck and the job offer from Harold with his signature scrawled in blue ink. I sat on the floor, holding the weight of where I started. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply acknowledged her, the girl I had been, who believed too deeply, gave too much, and waited too long. She wasn't weak. She was just unfinished. Back at the office Monday, I started drafting a document titled "How We Got Here, So No One Ever Forgets." It wasn't a memoir. It was a blueprint. I wrote about Susan's first day, Marcus's resistance turned loyalty, Claire's silence and eventual voice, and my own decision to stop asking for a seat and start building the damn table. I included mistakes too, times we moved too fast, assumed too much, and learned the hard way. I showed it to Elena first. "Is this a retirement letter?" she asked, half joking. "No," I said. "It's a memory manual, so no one ever says, 'It wasn't that bad.'" She nodded slowly. "Then I'll help you publish it." Spring bloomed without warning that year. Tulips, again, just like the ones Claire had once sent. I saw them on a street corner flower stand and bought a bunch for the front lobby. No note, no explanation. Just a quiet marker of growth in unexpected places. At the next company town hall, I stood at the back as Susan opened the meeting. "I want to tell you about a time I nearly gave up," she began, her voice unwavering. But someone told me my silence would protect me while killing someone else, so I spoke. There was no applause yet, just reverence. Her story wasn't mine, and that was the point. No one carried the torch alone here anymore. That was the final proof the culture had shifted. Leadership wasn't a spotlight. It was a floodlight. And everyone deserved to see the road ahead, clearly. In June, I booked my first vacation in years, a real one, without checking email or just one call. I left Susan as acting lead, confident she wouldn't burn the place down unless it needed rebuilding. As I packed, I found Harold's final email to me, still saved in a private folder. I reread it once, then finally deleted it. Forgiveness isn't always the absence of anger. Sometimes it's just refusing to carry someone else's weight one step further. I didn't forgive Harold. I outgrew him, and I made sure no one like him could ever thrive here again. That, to me, is victory. Thank you for listening to Patricia's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.